I'm thinking about emergent properties. This really comes out of all that stuff to do with will and consciousness and mind and all that. But I'm not really thinking about that directly. I'm trying to think about related things. And as I say, I'm thinking about emergence and emergent properties. As I understand it, and I'm not an expert by any means in this, an emergent property is a quality that is found within a collection or an amalgam or an aggregation of entities that is not predictable, or maybe not even found at all in the individual entities that make it up. So yeah, the reason why I think it's links to this stuff is that things like consciousness are often spoke of as emergent properties of brain activation. You know, as if brain activation is this series of wave fronts sweeping across the brain, which it probably is, or as I visualize it, like a swarm of insects, or as a flock of birds flying around in this strange landscape of the inside of your head. And it's the configuration of the swarm, you know, but the configuration that emerges from the action of each individual member of that swarm that gives rise to consciousness. That's the kind of metaphor I'm working with. So as I say, an emergent property is something that is a feature of a collection, but that isn't found in each individual member of that collection. I suppose what I'm thinking of here is to do with what happens when those collections do aggregate into things you might call entities or things. You know, whether that be a thing like consciousness, which I know isn't really a thing, but stay with me if you can. What happens when those entities do seem to give rise to things, particularly when those things are in connection with other things that are also the result of emergent properties. And I suppose I'm thinking particularly about a property like hardness. I'm just next to this fantastic tree here, which is in a state of disrepair, but it's still a marvellous tree. And this tree is, I'm going to just check, make absolutely sure, but this tree, I think I'm right in saying, is probably quite hard. So a quick test, the hypothesis, yes it is. It's hard, but that hardness, you know, that tree is made up of much smaller particles, isn't it? It's like molecules or atoms, or however far down you want to go. It's made up of an organised aggregate of other entities, smaller parts. And those smaller parts don't have a quality of hardness. You know, quarks and leptons and muons and all that kind of stuff are not hard. Electrons and photons aren't hard, atoms aren't hard, molecules aren't hard. It's only when you get to the stage to them being collected into this kind of a shape, this kind of a form, that they start, and this kind of a size actually, I guess, that words like hard become meaningful. And it's not a predictable quality, it's not something you can predict by looking at the elements that make it up. It's fantastic. You can hear the sound of that, isn't it? I guess it must be hollow inside. Okay, so it's got this quality of hardness. My hand has also got a fairly similar quality of hardness. It's also made up of the same constituent parts. It's also made of all those leptons and muons and bosons and all that kind of stuff, which make it, you know, the protons and the electrons and those things make up the atoms and the molecules and so on. And again, it has this emergent property of hardness, relative, not as hard as a tree, but hardness, which I can attest to. Yeah, it is. So when I put my hand on the tree, I'm feeling, you know, that interaction, that engagement between one hard object and the other hard object is not predictable by either the entities that make up that hard object or this hard object, I don't think. What's the guy doing? Let's stay. Anyway, and there's a whole series of things that come out of that. You know, there's a whole set of descriptive terms, you know, like resilience and resistance and force and pressure and texture and smoothness and weight perhaps, or sponginess, or yeah, just a whole set of terms which articulate that hardness, and more technical terms. You know, there are measures, formal measures of hardness, and instrumentations to measure hardness. But you're not measuring, again, that whole set of instrumentation, that whole set of terminology, and indeed the kind of physical descriptions, the physics, the type of physics that will result from the descriptions of that hardness, is particular to this emergent property in relation to this example of the same emergent property. And again, not predictable from the constituent parts. I suppose here I'm reminded of two things. I think I'm disagreeing with Pyro, who made this video in which he talks about pieces of paper containing magnets. You know, because atoms have magnetic properties, electromagnetic properties. Paper is made of magnets, therefore paper has electromagnetic properties. It's averaged out and becomes negligible. But in a sense that's irrelevant, because when you're talking about paper, there's a whole different set of emergent physics kicks in, or a different set of emergent properties kick in, which you would use a different set of physical descriptions, descriptive physics, to describe and make predictions about. And here I think I'm in agreement with Emblem of Being, who made a comment on one of my videos. He made a similar kind of thing in relation to parts and wholes. You know, when you're talking about, your physics has to be appropriate to the scale and the emergent properties that are appropriate to the scale at which you're working. So when you're working at the scale of trees and hands, you use the descriptive language of hardness, resilience, resistance, force, pressure, texture, and the physics which articulates that and makes predictions about that. When you're working at different scales, you use different terms, probably metaphorically, and a different physics. Which isn't to say you can't describe this stuff using other kinds of physics, but you wouldn't, because it'd be daft. I think it's different actually. My hand is different to the tree. I'm not saying my hand is like the tree. You know, my hand is clearly part of a different system, which has different emergent properties. And part of the emergent properties of my hand is things like pain and different kinds of sensitivities. So, yeah, different kinds of psychophysics would come into play there, I think.